Maybe a good way to start would be by just looking at, we're not going to do a big dunking, but actually just going through some of the points that have been made against you because just so people know, and they probably do, Aaron went to Syria. You triggered some folks, didn't torture them, just triggered some folks at the Young Turks. They made a video. There were some not nice things said about you. You took the high road, asked for a what was it? A redaction, a retraction, excuse me, Freudian slip, because they had said that you were paid by the Russians.
They said I was paid by Russia. They said that I seem to be working for dictators and that I deny the murder of children and chemical weapons attacks.
Yes.
Yeah.
And fuck you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And Anna Kasparian told her to fuck off and gave her the finger.
Yeah. Yeah. Fuck you, Aaron Mate.
And Cenk Uygur also said that this is where I just felt sad for him. Like he said, Aaron must be really warm in his little Russian blanket.
He said that? Oh my God.
Yeah,
wow. Yeah. Well, now we got to send
and I was thinking like the irony of a guy. Well, obviously
in Syria?
Like all that is just projection. Like this is a guy who claims to be progressive and positions himself as like a truth teller against the Democratic Party establishment. And he took $20 million from DNC mega donor Jeffrey Katzenberg. So he wrapped himself in the warm blanket of Jeffrey Katzenberg's money, and he's projecting his obvious discomfort with that onto me because his existence is basically a lie. And when your existence is a lie, you're going to be hostile to people who actually embody the principles that you falsely claim to represent. So that's what I think that was. And it was like a mixture of, I was angry at being lied about, but also there was some pity there involved too. I felt sorry for these people that's where their mind goes so automatically.
Well, I think, wrapped in, now I imagine Cenk wrapped in a little like donkey fur coat. I don't even know what donkeys have. What could you make? Because the DNC thing,
right? Yes.
But he's a Republican. Wait, what is Katzenberg? He's a
no. Katzenberg's a Democrat.
He is a Democrat.
I think Cenk is a former. I think Cenk is a former Republican.
He's Katzenberg. So it is.
Anyway, whatever. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
But then there was no apology, but the video was disappeared. And but what I think was interesting is that there was another video put up. And again, Aaron, you and I have often been on the kind of stayed above the fray for a couple minutes at least when it comes to these wars, right? And we kind of try to, relatively speaking, you certainly more than me, but not be like not make every single thing a force the vote war, right?
Sure, totally.
Yeah.
Like when force the vote happened, it happened. I disagreed with those who were against it, but it was over. It didn't happen.
And you didn't not talk to Bray. It wasn't like that was not the hill that you decided to die. You didn't write all these other people off. You don't go around looking for stuff to own the Young Turks on. But sometimes it's important to review it. And it brings me joy.
Look, I definitely made fun of them for Russiagate because that was, because anybody who claims to be progressive and claims to be a journalist who bought into, I think, one of the biggest psyops in history, a straight up disinformation campaign aimed at, among many things, protecting the failed neoliberals who lost to Donald Trump by blaming Russia and their bots and email hackers. Anybody who falls into that deserves to be made fun of. And the Young Turks were a shining example of that. And I had a good time making fun of them. I never did segments about them or told them to F off, but I certainly made fun of them on Twitter because it's funny and they deserve to be made fun of for that.
Right. So when I say that, I'm bringing this up because it brings me no pleasure to play what I'm about to play. I actually think it's useful. We're not dunking on anyone in any inappropriate way. And I think this may be actually a good way to like shape almost what you're going to tell us about your time in Syria, because it sets up some pretty interesting things. And the interesting thing is that, like, I think it's fair. I'm probably not going to take any liberties if I say that I don't think that the Young Turks regularly covers electoral politics of Syria. I don't think they had a report on this during the last elections. So I think
I don't think they cover Syria, period. And to the extent they do, I think they do it to parrot establishment talking points. And to illustrate the absurdity of the segment we're going to watch, the U.S. right now is occupying 1/3 of Syria militarily in the Northeast. The explicit goal, as Trump said, is to take the oil. as another U.S. official said, named Dana Stroul, she now works for Biden. She's a top official under Biden at the Pentagon. She said that the goal actually is not just to fight ISIS, as the U.S. says publicly, but it's to own 1/3 of Syria and use the leverage that the U.S. has in occupying 1/3 of its country and occupying a region where Syria's oil is, and also its wheat. It's the breadbasket of Syria. It's agricultural powerhouse, in Stroul's words, to use the U.S. occupation of that, what she calls the U.S. owning that part of Syria, as leverage to effectuate a political outcome in Syria that's in line with U.S. dictates, which essentially that the government has to go. So, so that is the context for what the U.S. is doing in Syria right now. And they're also imposing, am I still there? Am I still on?
Yeah, you're still on, yeah.
Okay, yeah. And it's also imposing these murderous sanctions that after helping to destroy Syria for 10 years with a multi-billion-dollar dirty war that, according to some estimates, cost the CIA over $1 billion per year, one of the most expensive in CIA's history. After helping to destroy Syria, leave it in ruins, as I saw firsthand, now it's imposing the harshest sanctions in the world under something called the Caesar Act. And so the Young Turks, I checked, has never done a single segment on these sanctions. And in this segment, Anna Kasparian, the host, claims that she has an anti-intervention ideology without even mentioning these sanctions or this military occupation. Yeah. So that's just an illustration of like where they're at with Syria. Right. It's like and that's why it's like it's awkward for me to comment on them, because I just think they're so ridiculous.
Well, I think actually what's weirder about this is that I don't think they ever would have done this if you hadn't appeared on it and they didn't get kind of embarrassed by cursing you out. Right. And I guess I'm bringing that up because I actually think it tells an uncomfortable truth about the media, which is that we all have, there are egos all over the place. And, you know, in some ways I'd rather have egos be running the show than imperialism. But sadly, those things can like overlap. But I was just embarrassed because I mean, it was a ridiculous segment for many reasons, but let's watch some of it. And over the course of that, of course, I would love to you can tell us what you actually learned on the ground. So let's just start playing, and then we can jump in and tell us about how long you were there for, what you saw there.
Another 7 years on the left.
Okay, so here's the thesis. Ready? Which is an important one.
Syria just held its presidential election, and unsurprisingly, Bashar al-Assad won his 4th term, which means he'll be serving another 7 years as the president of the country in what I'm sure was a totally free and fair election. I'm sure that there was no funny business going on, nothing undemocratic taking place. Now, of course, the truth is very different from that. I'm being incredibly sarcastic. But before I get to the details on what went down during this election, I want to be abundantly clear that as an individual who identifies on the left, you can both be against United States intervention or the United States meddling in these types of situations and also acknowledge when undemocratic behavior takes place. And that certainly is the case in the country of Syria. And I want to make the case that
pause it there.
Pause
it there.
That's a good, we should always do that speed. Yeah.
All right. So that's a good example. So what she's saying, this is a classic thing that people like this do, where they will claim to be anti-US intervention. They'll claim to be leftist, while simultaneously, in her case, in the case of this segment, omitting any of the most minimal facts about U.S. intervention, the 10-year dirty war launched by the CIA, the U.S. occupying 1/3 of the country, and the murderous sanctions that prevent it from rebuilding. Okay, imagine doing a segment about Syria right now, claiming that you're against intervention and not being able to name or acknowledge the most basic facts about the ongoing U.S. intervention that is making Syrians' lives miserable. That's the first thing. So basically, this is a classic thing where someone will claim to be anti-interventionist while omitting any of the facts about it, and then proceeding to advance all of the current talking points that are being used to justify U.S. intervention. So it's this cowardly thing of not wanting to own your actual position, which is simply, I'm going to be a useful idiot for imperialism and do exactly what the rest of the established media is doing, to the extent that it's talking about Syria at all.
Yeah.
And parrot all the talking points, create a straw man about, and reduce Syria again to, which is always the playbook, this one person, Assad, not a state full of people with different views. Reduce a state to this cartoonish portrayal of one person, as the U.S. always done in every single target of regime change. Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, you can go down the list. Because these dirty wars work by, basically obliterating the people who live in the countries that are affected by our policies. And that's what a segment like this plays into.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I was going to say. It's like, I actually think there is a whole interesting discussion to be had about how does the left do this, right? How do we walk and chew gum at the same time? I think they even said that. And how do we oppose regime change? And also, to what extent can we have a discussion about what needs to be done there? And if that's happening, how much does that need to be actually, just supporting the people back there? Blah, blah, blah. There's a whole, but
it's very simple.
Tell
me. It's very simple. Like, what can I say? First of all, the first thing to recognize is actually none of our business. We don't invite Syrians to get involved in our election and comment on it. We don't look to Syrian analysts for their analysis of the U.S. election. So first of all, it's none of our business.
Yes.
Second of all,
if you're a historian or political science, not to sound like I'm not like
no, sure you can talk about it, but it's like, but the thing is, the debate here is, are these Syrian elections legitimate?
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is, it's not the place of a Westerner to confer legitimacy on any election. I mean, are our elections legitimate?
No,
where our choices are between two corporate-owned parties. Look, am I saying that the Syrian elections are democratic? No, the government selects the candidates. It's an authoritarian country. I mean, that's obvious.
Right.
But the question is, at a time when the U.S. is imposing murderous sanctions on a country and occupying it, after a 10-year dirty war that helped destroy it, is it the role of a self-identified progressive to be hyper-focusing on the talking points that are being used to advance the ongoing deprivation of Syria? I mean, no, it's a joke. And by the way, also, look, anyway, we can go on with this.
My point was that, like, I'm not doing some both sidesism thing. I actually was saying that there is a discussion that can be had in some form, but at the same time, when you have a show and you have any sway and your headline for your YouTube video is Syrian dictator wins 95% vote in sham election, like, what do you think you're bringing to the conversation?
Yeah, you're just repeating. You're repeating establishment talking points, as this video illustrates, because her main sources are two neocon think tank analysts who she cites, including a former Israeli soldier in the Washington Post.
Yes. Basically, what your takeaway is, both what you saw on the ground is not exactly. I mean, you yourself said that it was creepy. There are a lot of Assad photos. There's nothing that I don't think newsworthy about that, though. And there
were a lot of Assad.
Yeah.
But again, you know what? I don't want to actually disparage it, because again, to people who've just lived through a war where the alternative is living under Saudi armed fanatics. Yeah. Assad is understandably a hero because he's the face of the government that liberated those towns.
Right.
And people can't process that thought because Westerners have been so bombarded with propaganda aimed at demonizing Assad. This is always the case. Again, even though we've lived through the Iraq War, we lived through Libya, this happens. It's the same playbook every single time. In the name of human rights, we have to go and destroy a foreign country and stop it from this bloodthirsty dictator. In the case of Iraq, I mean, there was truth to it. Saddam did commit huge atrocities against some people. In the case of Assad, the atrocities that Syria and Russia were committed in the process of defending their country from a war. So if you're actually opposed to Syrian atrocities, then you should oppose the war that they were fighting and defending their country against. The alternative was letting their country being taken over by, as John Kerry privately admitted, ISIS. There's a leaked conversation with John Kerry. I'll try to find it and send it to you. You can play it. Where he admitted that the reason Russia intervened in Syria was because they didn't want a Daesh government. Okay, so basically, the alternative in Kerry's eyes was Assad or a Daesh government. So I just sent you the clip in the chat if you want to play it.
Okay, great, yeah.
So that's the reality that people can't process. They can't process that a country that has been so demonized doesn't want to live under conditions that we would never accept for ourselves. And that is where the Western chauvinism comes in. And what's funny is you'll have some people who claim, I'm against U.S. intervention, but I'm also against the Syrian government, and their campaign to defeat the rebels. So basically, okay, so what are you for then? Basically you're being a coward. You're saying that you're going to say you oppose intervention, but you're also going to oppose the government defending itself against the intervention. So basically, you're for nothing, and you're ultimately taking the side of the intervention if you're denying the country that's being attacked the right to defend itself. And that's the intellectual cowardice that, unfortunately, is so prevalent. And it is exhausting to deal with it because people are so dishonest. But look, for those who are outside of it, it's a good opportunity to look at how propagandized our Western system is, and the effort that is taken to try to manufacture consent for criminal things like dirty wars.
Yeah. And you have a hard out in a few minutes, right?
I do.
Okay. So I can play the video when you're gone.
Okay.
But yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for this. And come back on. We'll go through more propaganda stuff. And, as Aaron is very reasonable and everyone likes to smear him. And then if you actually read what he's written, he's not really the conspiracy theorist that people say. And in fact, people should be skeptical of things that they're reading.
Well, one indication of that is that for all the hate I get or I may get, there's not one single article out there that takes up my actual views. And that's what I constantly have to do. That's what I constantly have to do. I constantly have to say when someone disparages me, can you cite my actual views to justify your characterization of them? And they can't. They can't. The same thing with Russiagate, which is the dumbest thing of all time, but yet people still felt entitled to try to, question my integrity on that one, even though it was such an obvious scam. And everyone knows that now. And same thing with Syria too, and this OPCW thing, the chemical weapons thing. No one can ever cite my actual views to substantiate the, very outlandish and serious claims that they make about me. And there's a reason for that, because they can't. They have no argument. They're doing this from an emotional place for whatever reason.
Yeah. All right. Well, come back because I have a lot of other arguments that I want to go through with you and debunk with you, because they are very much worth debunking. But Aaron, thank you so much again, and come back and we'll do some more deep dives and some more media analysis.
Sounds good.
Okay. Bye, Aaron. Bye. Good night. That was great. Oh yeah, put any weird ass tweets by Higgins or Bellingcat under my tweets about that. Okay. Bye everyone. Oh, become Patreon supporters if you're not. Patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Okay. Hit like. Yeah, hit like. Bye, everyone.